right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Core Guinee. It's August 10th, 2021. We're outside the Nicholson Library at Linfield University. Corey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, super happy to have been invited to participate.
Awesome. Let's start with the first and most important question. Why wine?
I feel like wine picked me, honestly. I grew up in Colorado and in a family that there was no drinking, no beer, no wine. So did not grow up around it. Came out to Portland for college, Reed College. Was a chemistry major there and developed an interest in art, actually, through some art history classes. Also met my wife through one of those art history classes. And it was through her family that I was introduced to wine. I can remember one of the first times I went to visit her family, and so I don't know anything about wine. And her dad opened up a few bottles of, red wines and poured them all out. And, what are the differences? I couldn't tell the difference between any of them. They all seemed the same, just like red wine. So I really am sort of late to the game as far as wine goes, and really started from scratch.
So you've mentioned a little bit of this already, but take us kind of through your upbringing. You mentioned growing up in Colorado. Tell me about kind of life growing up and what made you decide to come to Reed.
Growing up, very outdoors oriented, hiking and camping, fishing, that kind of thing. Was a good student in high school, and kind of got to senior year, and the college counselor said, what are you thinking about as far as places to go? And I hadn't honestly really been thinking about that much. Someplace in Colorado, CSU, CU. She said, well, let me put together a list of colleges that might be interesting for you. And so she put together a whole list, and the very last one on the list, we were going through it, she said, I put this one on there, but I don't really know you that well, but there is this school in Portland, Oregon. It's kind of a strange place. And so as soon as she said that, that's the one that's like stood out. So didn't go visit the college, got in, showed up in the fall, and started going to college, having now done two daughters through the college process. One's currently at U of O. A lot more went into it for them than it did for me. Mine was pretty random. But man, ended up at a great place. Worked really hard, played really hard, and wound up with a degree in chemistry, which I wasn't really expecting to do. I thought I was going to be a biology major, but just really liked the chemistry department, and I was kind of good at it, and I'd never taken chemistry in high school even, so it was kind of a shocker. But during summer breaks, when my peers all were getting summer jobs working in labs in preparation for grad school or medical school, I went home to Colorado and had jobs working for the Forest Service. So I would spend my summers backpacking around the wilderness areas above Aspen, Colorado, taking taking samples from high alpine lakes as part of an air quality monitoring project. So that was a pretty great way to spend summers. And honestly, that's kind of what I visualized myself doing, was trying to graduate and then maybe get on permanent with the Forest Service, maybe do like summers with the Forest Service and winters with the Aspen Skiing Company, do that kind of thing. I didn't have any kind of like master plan. But second semester of senior year, met my wife, and things changed, plans changed. So ended up coming back to Portland. We got married, had our first daughter, and I was originally pursuing potentially a career in art conservation. The idea being combining my interest in art with my science background. But not a lot of that happening in Portland, and pretty daunting to move the family to the East Coast for grad school. And so had kind of a mini career of exploring that. And then we made the decision to move down to the Bay Area to be closer to her family. And that's really when I connected with the wine industry.
So before we talk about the connecting with the industry itself, you mentioned kind of your first experience with wine the beverage. Was there anything about that, or at what point were you excited about learning more about wine at all, or was that not until you thought about the industry further?
Yeah. And I think the thing that really was piqued my interest was my wife's grandparents had retired in the Loire Valley in France. And the family would go there basically every summer since she was a kid. And part of going there was making visits to local cellars. And I don't speak any French, and so I wasn't understanding all the conversation that was happening, but just the experience of going to a winery and having the person that is really proud of what they've made, taste you through their products and show you their cellar. And obviously there a lot of history. It's sort of an older situation. So that's probably where I first kind of started to formulate this. Okay, if art conservation isn't going to work out, chemistry and wine, it seems like there might be something there.
So now you're in the Bay Area, obviously, a whole different kind of wine country down there. Tell me about coming into contact with the industry and kind of your first initial impressions and interactions.
Yeah, I remember we would we'd go do wine tasting with our parents. They were wine club members at different places and that sort of thing. I was super naive about the wine production process. I really didn't know anything about it. And actually, to kind of back up a little bit, when I first was looking at making the switch to the wine industry, we were living in Portland. And I remember, going down to the Reed computer lab and getting on the email and our internet and found like a Willamette Valley Wineries list of wineries, and just sort of sent an email to everybody, Hi, I don't really know much about it, but I have a chemistry degree. Is that useful to you? And two people replied, actually. Amy Wesselman, who was also a Reedy, and she was nice enough to meet with me for coffee and kind of talk about lab work and what wineries need. And the other person was Sam Tannehill, who was at Archery Summit at the time. And he invited me up to Archery Summit and had a similar chat. And all of this was happening in like late November. And they're like, okay, so, if you had reached out to us 3 months ago when we were looking for, people for harvest, would have been great. But we're at the time now where we're, letting people go. So that's why, I didn't really understand anything about the industry. But during the conversation with Sam, he's like, well, if you're interested in chemistry and the chemistry of wine, then you should look at getting a job with ETS Laboratories down in California. And I said, oh, okay. And I honestly didn't write it down or anything, so I'm like, okay, they're in California and I'm up here, so. But as it turns out, when we moved down to California and I started looking for a job down there, applying to wineries to be a lab tech, ETS also posted a job. And so I got hired on with ETS. I guess it would have been 2000, 2001.
Tell me about that job, and tell me about your kind of initial impressions of the work being done there.
Oh, it's great. I mean, it's just a world-class laboratory. Really nice people working there. I hadn't really spent a whole lot of time doing lab work. I'd done some in college, but I'd never had like a job in a lab. So even though I had a chemistry degree, it was kind of a steep learning curve to learn all the lab tech type tasks. But I was familiar with instrumentation, and so I got trained on a bunch of different analyzers, and it was at the time when they were developing what has now become a real workhorse analyzer for the industry, which is made by a company called Foss, and it's called the Wine Scan. And it was an instrument that was originally developed for the milk industry, doing milk analysis. I think this is right. And then Foss was working with ETS and Gallo to kind of develop it for the wine industry. So that was really interesting to participate in kind of the early stages of that analyzer. But the thing about working at the main lab in St. Helena, as an analyst, I was interfacing with wine and wine samples as just slices of the sample. Like the tests that were my responsibility, I would go get the sample tube and take my little aliquot and do the analysis, enter the data in the computer, and then keep going, But I would never see like the final reports, I wasn't seeing the big picture of what was happening. I could tell that it was important because lots of winemakers are going through there and we're getting lots of samples, and but I wasn't talking with any winemakers, and I wasn't kind of interfacing on the level of why people run analysis. So during that time, the Davisons here in town, who had developed a winery supply division, had outgrown kind of the temporary space that they were in and decided to build a new building to house their winery supplies operation. And they had the foresight to allocate space in that building for analytical services, which is something that local winemakers had been asking for, right? And the Davisons reached out to the couple big labs in California at the time, and the owners of ETS said, yeah, let's do it. That sounds great. And I basically raised my hand and said, I'd be happy to go back to Oregon and participate in that. So the first harvest doing that was 2002, but it was in the old winery supply building because the new winery supply building construction was delayed. So we did the first harvest technically in 2002 in the old space, but we weren't really doing a whole lot. 2003 was really the launch of that ETS satellite lab.
What went into it from your perspective? You're going from kind of working as one of many in a lab to sort of setting up a whole new space. So tell me about that challenge for you.
It was a steep learning curve. It was, I was in basically way over my head because I didn't know anything about the winemaking production process. I didn't know why people were submitting samples and when they were submitting samples. I didn't know the language of winemaking. That was a big hurdle for me, actually. I remember that first harvest, it was great because we were in the winery supply building, so people were constantly coming into the building. They'd come over and introduce themselves and ask about, the lab and how it worked, have little conversations. And I remember somebody saying, I think I'm gonna go pick fruit, next week. I was like, oh, that's awesome. What kind of fruit are you gonna get? No, I really said that, And they're like, oh, we're getting grapes, we're gonna harvest the grapes. So is that real kind of, that disconnect from being a lab technician and just running analyzers to interfacing with owner winemakers. And so the nice thing that happened is that they didn't know much about using the analytical services, right? And so it ended up being a situation where we were kind of teaching each other, People were teaching me about winemaking and why they were interested in the numbers, teaching me the language. And at the same time, I was helping them understand why it was valuable to spend money to get numbers. And so it was this nice kind of teaching each other thing that happened. But I was definitely in over my head.
At the time, do you remember, were there certain numbers or certain tests that were most important, or that people were coming in for the most? Were there certain things that people were most excited to know?
Well, it was interesting, people would come over and introduce themselves, and they'd say, ETS, we love you guys. You guys are fantastic. Whenever I have a problem with my wine, I send a sample right down to you. And it's like, okay, that's great. That's one of the services that the lab can offer. But the more important service that the lab offers, it allows people to be proactive in their production process so that they avoid problems. So is this shift in mentality from I use the lab when I have a problem to I use the lab to avoid problems. And so a big part of that really was convincing people to spend money on juice analysis and running full juice panels where you get a complete picture of your raw material. People were used to running TA pH bricks in-house, but why do I need to run, potassium? Why is that important? Why do I need to know how much malic acid and tartaric acid is in there if I already have a TA number? So why should I spend, why do I need to spend $100 to get those numbers? So that was a big part of it, was really trying to shift people into thinking about the lab as a tool that allows you to make informed winemaking decisions. And ETS came up, did seminars and put a lot of effort into that, and people latched onto it, and they embraced the idea that, okay, I've just spent many months and many dollars growing my raw material. Now I've got it. The extra cost of a sample to find out what you have to work with and what adjustments need to be made, it's super important. So that for me was really the biggest thing that lab did for people was providing juice analysis.
Did you find from people who were working with you that you kind of brought over to the side of doing this analysis and getting the numbers and being proactive? Did you find people reacting that it was making a difference in the finished product?
Yeah, absolutely. It's people have been kind of trying to operate kind of blind for a while, for many years, really. And once you start to kind of see how the numbers stitch together, right? The juice panel numbers translate into your finished product and where you end up. Once you see that happen and you start hitting the product that you want to make at the end, because you knew what you were starting with at the beginning, then it becomes very quickly an indispensable thing, I think if you ask most winemakers now, if they would, try to do a harvest without knowing juice panel numbers. I think very few of them would say, yeah, sure, no problem, TAPH bricks, it's fine. And a big part of that is that it allows people to do what I'm most interested in, which is to make a sound wine every time. Every time you're controlling the basic quality parameters of the product, and you get that pinned down, and once you get to that point, then you can start to really work on the stylistic goals. But if you have something that's a moving target already, then trying to apply stylistic type decisions, there's lots of different products that can be used, your barrel program is huge. All these stylistic decisions, if you're trying to pin those to a product that is really variable, then what ends up in the bottle is going to be really variable. Maybe sometimes you hit it just right, maybe not. But if we can pin down and make a clean wine, start to finish, my feeling is then it allows people to really dial in stylistically what they want to show.
So tell me about your initial impressions. Obviously, you're still learning wine, and you're still learning terminology, you're still learning all of that. What were kind of your initial impressions of Oregon's industry, of the people in it, and of the wines being produced?
Everybody was so friendly, talking about the people. Very friendly, very excited about the Davison building, very excited that ETS was up. Very clearly a collaborative industry, people working together. Again, at the time when I was in California in the Napa Valley, I wasn't interfacing with winemakers, so I can't really speak firsthand about what it was like down there. But the other thing I do, in addition to the labs, I rep for a French cooperage, and I remember one of the cooperage reps coming over. We're touring around visiting people. And he was just like, this community up here is just unbelievable. It's like, it's so great. I'm like, yeah, don't you see this other places? Because he goes around the world, right? And he said, no, this is very unique. It just doesn't really exist in the same way, this sort of collaborative spirit. So I wasn't here at the beginning, obviously, so I don't really know, but I'm sure a lot of people that you've interviewed have talked about how important that was. As far as the wines that were being made, it was the days of unfined, unfiltered, and so there was a lot of variability in what happened in the bottle. Unfortunately, plenty of times people would come in with bottled samples that, were re-fermenting or whatever, and so it sent a fair number of samples down to the main lab for figuring out what was going on in the bottle. And that made a big impression on me, actually, because people were so discouraged by that. You've done all this work. It's in the bottle, and then it goes sideways in the bottle. So again, getting back to my interest in helping people control those quality parameters so that what ends up in the bottle is clean, sound, isn't going to go sideways. Even if you do want to do unfined, unfiltered, you controlled the parameters so that it's probably going to be okay. So that was a big one, big hurdle to overcome. And then the other impression I have from the wines then was that particular cellars would kind of end up with having the same, each year there'd be the same problem. And for me, winemaking is all about, there's never going to be any expert winemaker because there's just too many variables involved, and you just don't get enough chances to make your product to develop a real level of expertise. But what I think the really good winemakers do is, as they've been going through the process, they encounter some problem, some issue, and they figure out why it happened, and then they change their systems so it doesn't happen again. And then the next thing comes up, and you solve that, doesn't happen again. And then you get to a point where then you can really, you've seen the primary things that can pop up and figured out how to control them. And then you can really start, consistently making great wine. But the point is with that I could see that there was kind of this disconnect of thinking about wine as a production process. It's like any other product, and that coming out of ETS, we had very, strict written protocols for how you do, written quality assurance system. And if you have that or some version of that in your winery, then it does allow you to, as you encounter issues, you can make changes to your system and set those changes in protocols or checklists or whatever. So part of that was ETS, but part of it was also when I was exploring the art conservation world. I was working for an artist oil paint manufacturer in Portland called Gamblin Artist Colors, and they developed a line of conservation paints. But I was coming out of that production environment, and it was a production environment that was a kind of a single day turnaround. You'd show up in the morning, you have raw oil, raw pigment, you have to get it mixed, milled, through the tube filler, labeled, and ready to go out the door. So, is that I was coming out of that sort of production mentality of protocol-based, environment. So when I left ETS, a big reason I left ETS was to get involved more directly with wineries, to try to offer that service to people of not only helping them with their own in-house labs, but helping them develop quality assurance systems, and to think about winemaking as a production process. And that was really fun to do. Yeah.
Well, before we get to that, I'm curious about sort of. You mentioned people were pretty receptive to the idea. Did you find many people in the industry who were already there, or was the chemistry kind of missing from the industry at that point?
As far as the lab work went, there were a handful of winemakers, as I recall, or wineries that had pretty decent in-house labs. Maybe even had like an enologist on staff, or at least a lab tech on staff, and basically had more or less the same capabilities as what our lab had. So there were some sellers that were definitely already up to speed on lab work and using lab work proactively. But those are typically the medium to bigger wineries, where they could have this differentiation of people and responsibilities. They could have kind of an org chart, as opposed to the smaller wineries, owner, winemaker, maybe an assistant, trying to do sales and marketing as well, trying to do the business side of things as well. Most of the time in those situations, the lab work was maybe something that didn't get kept up on. The other thing with doing lab work, if you're a small winery, that's really challenging, is that you're not running labs every day. Okay, our lab, we're running samples every day. So our analyzers are always working. We're always, we're watching our quality control samples, and we know how the systems are behaving. We have systems in place to know if an analytical system is starting to go out of control. We can fix it. But if you have an SO2 apparatus in your winery, And he bought the reagents for that. And you pull samples and you run them, great. And then you don't come back to that apparatus for another couple months. And the reagents have been sitting for a while. The apparatus, maybe it's a little dirty, you know. You don't have a written protocol, so you have to try to remember like how to run it. No quality control sample, which is super important. So you can run your samples and you're going to get numbers. But how do you have confidence that those numbers are accurate? Any analytical system, you run a sample, it gives you a number. But the trick is, how do you know that those numbers are accurate? And so early days with ETS, this was a big part of the conversation with people, is they would come in and they would say, you know, they bring in a sample, SO2, I'd run it, send the report to them. The next day they come back, yeah, you ran that sample and you didn't get the right number. It's like, okay, you know, we can certainly recheck it, but why do you think my number's wrong? Well, you know, I ran that same sample and I ran it 3 times in-house and I got the same number every time. Okay, that's great, you know. That repeatability is what you want in your system. But just because you get the same number 3 times doesn't mean you're getting the right number, the accurate number 3 times. And then it's, many, many light bulb moments like that. But you can appreciate that if you're a small winery, you don't have access to analytical, like an outside independent lab to check against, and you don't have some sort of a control sample to give you feedback on if your system is giving you accurate numbers, then that's what you would default to. You would run it multiple times to see if you're getting the same number, and think, okay, yeah, I've got the right number. So with something like SO2, people could end up thinking that they had 30 parts of free SO2, when actually they had 10 parts of free SO2. Going into the bottle, okay, if you're at 30, that could be enough. Unfined, unfiltered, that could be enough. You go in with 10 parts, unfined, unfiltered, that might not be enough. So there was definitely definitely this process of people testing me out, and wrapping their mind around this notion that their in-house numbers may not be accurate.
Interesting.
So some interesting conversations along those lines.
I can imagine. So yeah. So you talked about kind of the steep learning curve of wine and terminology and numbers and all of the things. So how long did it take you working to feel confident and comfortable talking about sort of wine at that level with people who were in the industry? How long until you felt comfortable with the vocabulary? You know, to be honest with you, I've resisted being comfortable with it. I mean, I just really have, you know. I really have always tried to take the position, which is the right position, which is that the wineries bringing in samples, those winemakers, you know, they're the experts about their process and about winemaking in general. And I've become conversant with it over the years. I can pretty fluently speak the language, but I always defer to winemakers as being the experts, you know? I can talk about numbers and how numbers can inform the decision-making process. But even with my work, when I was consulting for wineries, helping them develop these written quality assurance programs, it was me interviewing them and just writing down their process and asking questions. Okay, you say you do it this way, but you know, can you explain more of that and where does that come from? And so the idea being really to try to help people pin down their own process. It's actually one of the challenges of, we've got a Linfield intern
who starts tomorrow, and
Nice.
another Linfield intern that starts next week,
Awesome.
which is great. But that's one of the big challenges of having interns come in, and because we're a small lab, they could very well be the ones that go to receive the samples from clients. Is how do we try to bring them up to speed on some of the kind of nomenclature and abbreviations that people will use on their sample labels that helps, with logging in correctly, some of the language. The interns will learn a little bit of that, but really you want to have new analysts in the lab. Depending on how familiar they are with the winemaking process, it can take a little bit of time to learn the language.
Oh, I have a question from the audience.
Okay, great.
What does it take to be a chemical analyst, and do you need a chemistry background for it?
For the work that we're doing as an analytical lab, I'm actually more interested in, when I'm looking to hire people, I'm more interested in if people have experience working in production. I love people who have experience in food service. Food service experience translates fantastic to the work that we do at the lab. Fast-paced, attention to detail. A science background is necessary. I need a basic familiarity with being in a lab and basic lab techniques, and but everything that we do in the lab is completely trainable. One of the things that my the two people who are my lab techs now, my analysts now, fantastic. During COVID times and coming off of the smoke year last year where winery production was way down, it hasn't been as busy at the lab as we were expecting. It's natural. But one of the things that they've spent a lot of time doing is working on the written protocols. And really, because we had some basic ones, but honestly, a lot of times they wouldn't get used, and they've really done a great job building those for us. And now with the Linfield interns starting, it's going to be our chance to test those out and to actually, see how quickly we can bring somebody up to speed using very detailed instructions on how to run different methods. So the other thing that I'm most interested in, honestly, with hiring people or people that join the lab, is people that reach out to me. Both people that are working now, Jason and Christine, they both just reached out to me. I didn't have a job posted or anything, and they showed interest, and they seem like great people, and we found a place for them. So that's one thing, talking to young people who are especially just getting ready to start careers and that sort of thing. I always encourage people to just reach out, to businesses that look interesting, and talk to people. Don't wait for people to post an ad, reach out and talk to people.
Absolutely. So you talked about kind of ending your time at ETS and going in different directions. Tell me how long at ETS, and when it came time to leave, how formulated was the plan at that point when you decided to leave ETS? How formulated was your next step?
So I worked for ETS from basically 2001 to through the harvest of 2009, and after the harvest of 2009, then I started my own business, which I called Core Enology. It was, I've been thinking about making a change for a couple years at that point. the startup of the satellite lab was great, and it was new clients, and I was learning a lot, and they were learning a lot, and we were kind of building the thing. And then at a certain point, it got to where we'd kind of signed everybody up, And so then it became just running samples, which the laboratory is not exactly my natural environment. And that coupled with seeing how people, were needing help potentially with their own in-house processes and labs. It was a hard decision, obviously. I mean, anytime you leave an established job to start out on your own with something that's never been presented to people before. Okay. Coupled with the fact that I'm not exactly a self-promoter. That's not something that is in my skill set, really. But a handful of people signed up, and I'm really proud of the work that we did for, I guess it was, 5 or 6 years, helping people get their production processes documented. It was really very successful. And during that time while I was doing that, I was also repping for this French cooperage, Tonellerie de Mercure, which is something I just fell into. I wasn't looking for that, but Rick DeFerrari, who has Oregon Barrel Works, knew that Mercure was looking for some help repping their barrels in the Pacific Northwest. Went to Unified in Sacramento, met with our general manager, and again, I didn't know anything about barrels, but I knew a lot of people. And so they were willing to kind of like bring me on board and give me time to kind of learn how barrels worked. So left ETS with kind of a plan, but really just wanted to get out there and just see what where I might fit.
So we'll talk about Coronology first, and I'm curious, as you were presenting to the initial clients, as you were kind of seeking those first people, what did you offer? What did you present yourself as being able to do, and was that actually what ended up happening? Did it change in the process?
I would say that, basically what I pitched to people is what we ended up doing, which was kind of a fixed monthly fee for me to help them, for me to do the work, really, to create the documentation for to capture their production process, their unique production process, / help them with their labs. So introducing like a quality assurance sample, quality control sample, which we've always used Franzia bag-in-the-box. Makes a fantastic control sample. So introducing some laboratory concepts, but also then the side of it that was related to creating the quality assurance system was really an interesting process, because it meant bringing everybody together and talking about the process together. And you would find these disconnects. Like one person would think they were doing things this way, and the other person thought they were doing things this way. And so then we'd have to reconcile that, right? And so there was one of the other hats I wear is I serve as a volunteer mediator for your community mediation here in McMinnville, and which I love. But the process of working with wineries, there was a lot of mediation involved. There was, we definitely got into relationship territory and internal politics and sorting a lot of that out. So in addition to just like creating documents, it was also great for me because I felt like I was really helping people with the culture of their place. And that was pretty exciting. So that part of I didn't necessarily expect, but I really liked. I did get into writing like OSHA programs for people and helping people improve their OSHA programs. That's not something that I was anticipating doing, but it was clearly something people needed and kind of was a nice thing to transition to after we'd kind of done the production protocols. Yeah, so part of me, if this opportunity to start my own lab hadn't kind of materialized out of nowhere, then I'd probably still be working with wineries and different wineries, more wineries. And I'm a little bit, bummed isn't the right word, but it would have been interesting to see like how many people I could have worked with, and if we could have kind of kept that consulting model going.
It's almost like a wine psychologist at that point.
Honestly, yeah. I mean, it kind of, it's the winemaking is so dynamic. It's such a dynamic production process. The culture of every winery is different, and so that was always really interesting. Interesting for me to see kind of the culture of the winery, and then also see how really the culture of the place translates pretty directly into the bottle. That was really interesting, especially owner winemaker. The owner winemaker's kind of personality and approach and the way they decision making, that really does end up in the bottle. It's neat.
We've heard that recently that tense wineries make tense wine, and I like that. It sounds like that's your experience as well.
Yeah, I think so, and vice versa too. Yeah, wineries that are more nonchalant about the process, and they end up with wines that are not tight. And so for me, as far as like penning down the process, I wasn't necessarily looking to try to shift people to change their culture, right? Just trying to tighten it up so that they were making consistent wines.
When it came to exploring winemaking processes at that level, that's a pretty kind of unique thing for you to kind of dive into that many wineries and get down to the very nitty-gritty. Did you find that everyone was different? Were there similarities across wineries that you were seeing, or was every production process fairly unique?
It's this kind of wonderful thing about winemaking that everybody is doing the same thing. But there's so many little decisions over the course of the annual cycle that have to be made. And it's all those little decisions that add up to pretty big differences in the bottle. So we did a lot of flow charts actually to capture the process. And kind of everybody's flow chart looked more or less the same. Except for just little differences, in the flow chart. It's something for, people who are looking to get into winemaking, younger people, really encourage people to try to work at as many different places as possible. See as many different styles, see as many different approaches, see different equipment, see different scales of winemaking. The work I did with consulting for wineries, owner winemakers, that was the other takeaway, is I could see how people, at a certain point you get locked in. And once you're kind of a brand, or once you're like the head winemaker, it becomes difficult to try to change things up. People can do some trials, but to really try to change the way your approach to winemaking at that point isn't super easy. So getting a diverse exposure to different different facilities, styles, early on, so that when you become the winemaker or you start your own label, you've got a pretty clear idea of what you do and don't want to do. Yeah.
Love that. That's such an interesting perspective. I want to talk about the other thing you talked about, barrel sales, the cooperage. So again, you kind of falling into that. How long did it take you to get up to speed, and what were you finding as you were kind of learning about barrels and learning about people's uses of them that maybe surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, the theme of my career in the wine industry has been just getting in way over my head on every job, the lab here, way over my head. Barrels, way over my head. Barrels is super interesting. As a consumer, you see the label and it says, 30% new French oak. That new French oak is a huge range of different barrel options. So it's this really interesting part of winemaking that is kind of impossible for a consumer to appreciate. You just cannot appreciate that until you get into the cellar and you start tasting the same wine in different barrels side by side. And again, I wasn't, going back to when my father-in-law put the wines out, and they all kind of taste the same, I was still kind of in that mode, The lab, we don't taste the samples that come through. We would drink wine at home, but we weren't necessarily we weren't trying wine side by side, and we just didn't have that same level of understanding that winemakers have, where they're so close to the product and they can see the really small differences between different barrels. So the same thing, at the beginning they all tasted the same. So I pretty much just tried to shut up and just listen to how people were talking about barrels, taste, and try to make those connections and trying to understand what Mercure was trying to accomplish with their range of barrels. Historically with Mercure, the first barrels that came to Oregon were fairly heavy-handed. Mercure as a cooperage grew out of a stave mill in France. So Nicolas Tartaret and his wife Carol, Nicolas, his parents had the first sawmill in the Champagne region. So Nicolas and his brother grew up in the forest, seeing trees being felled, seeing them go through the sawmill. So they're looking at trees from kind of the intrinsic qualities of the wood. They get older. Nicolas' brother starts a flooring business, flooring mill, making wood flooring, and Nicolas goes into staves. Shortly after he started a stave mill, the staves have been seasoned, they were ready to sell to coopers. There was a big freeze in Bordeaux. I think I have this right. Big freeze in Bordeaux. So the coopers aren't making any barrels because the wineries aren't making any wine. So Nicolas got all this stave wood ready to go. And he came to the US and toured around asking if anybody here needed staves. And I think went to a winery, a big California winery, and they said, well, we can't use staves, but if you made barrels, then we could buy your barrels. I think I have the story right.
It's a good story either way.
So I reached out to a small cooper in the village of Mercure and had a winemaking consultant that was kind of coaching on toasting and this sort of thing, and they just started. And and then these barrels started coming to Oregon, and some people really liked them, some people really didn't like them, and But Mercury is a really, I think, a really neat cooperage because of this background in the intrinsic qualities of the wood. And so they've never emphasized forest of origin, which is very common with barrels. They've never done that. They've always created blends of wood based on the intrinsic qualities of the staves. So grain tightness, but also color, aroma, terroir, you know? So in a forest, you've got a range of different growing conditions for the trees in the same forest. But they know exactly where the tree came from, right? And so they can mark that and separate that wood out during the stave production process. The key to this is that it allows Mercury to do these really, really beautiful light toast barrels. So if you take a normal blend of staves that you might use for like a medium plus, heavy toast barrel, the wood itself doesn't necessarily matter so much because you're applying such a heavy toast to it. It becomes more kind of about the toast, right? But if you try to apply a light toast to that same blend, the characters that come through might not be nice, you know? Coarseness, greenness, that sort of thing. But if you're selecting the right stave material, very high purity, the right type of terroir, and you apply a light toast to that, then you get these barrels that become not on top of the wine, but actually are more supporting the wine and just amplifying the wine. And so people in the last 5 or 6 years have really gravitated to these barrels, especially for Chardonnay. Perfect for Chardonnay, you know, where you don't want barrel impact, but you do want the barrel to organize the wine, amplify it, present it. And this all happens because of the expertise in the forest and in the stave mill. So that's been super fun to help to give people that option. Because previously, and I think this is true of Oregon wines kind of going back, is that generally they were pretty barrel forward. And I think once I sort of understood barrels, then I started to understand that and hear this fatigue with growing this beautiful fruit, shepherding the wine through the process, right? And then ending up in the bottle, and then what you taste is a barrel. And people want to taste their wine. So that's been the fun part of doing the Mercury barrels for me.
You talked about the shift you've seen in the past 2 years in that, especially here, especially with Chardonnay. Are you, as you're in kind of engaging with people talking about barrels, do you find changing opinions in general? Do you find a lot of varied opinions? Do you find that Oregon is fairly in lockstep? What's the kind of the status of the industry?
I feel like as far as barrels go, it feels like people are starting to operate on a pretty sophisticated level. Working with different sizes of barrels, and I'm going to expand it actually, and say also working with concrete vessels and really large oak vessels, and the industry continuing to embrace innovation and these different tools that are out there. So, and that same with oak adjuncts, staves and chips and that kind of thing. The people getting to a level of sophistication where, okay, the vineyards are pretty dialed in at this point, right? Winemaking is getting pretty dialed in. And now people can really start to do this fine-tuning with these different options that are available. And that's super fun to see people do that, because I think most winemakers have kind of a vision for what they're hoping to achieve in the bottle, what they want to drink, what they want to present. And So seeing people experiment with all these different types of tools to achieve that, it's fun to watch, yeah, and participate in.
So you mentioned the opportunity for your own lab came up at some point. So let's talk about that and getting that going.
Yeah, that was not on the radar at all. Like I said, I'd kind of done the lab thing, and I was happy to be, building this consulting thing and, building the barrel thing. After I left ETS, I was also doing consulting for the Davisons, for the winery supply, and helping them with a little bit with their laboratory products that they sold, that sort of thing. So, the Davisons they were huge for me when I moved up here because I didn't know anybody, and we're trying to start this lab, and they were super helpful in getting things set up, and so I've always had just a really great relationship with them, and really love them as a family, and really love that they stepped up and put a lot of resources behind offering this to offering the winery supplies and the lab to the industry. So when it was announced that ETS was leaving the building, well, of course that's what the model is. The model is winemaking supplies and analytical services. That's the model. So there really was no question that we had to find somebody to put a lab in there. So we reached out to the other big lab in California, VinQuery, which has now been purchased by ETS and doesn't exist anymore. And because VinQuery was owned by Enardis, and Enardis has winemaking products, which Davison sells. So it seemed like a natural thing. But they didn't, this was in, let's say, May of 2015. So May of 2015, and we need to have a lab up and running by harvest. And it's a blank slate. All the stuff is gone. It's just 2 drains in the floor where the sinks go, and that's it. So they passed. And we thought about a couple other options, but in the end it was like, we just need to do this ourselves. So, Coronology Analytical Services is a partnership between myself and the Davison family. And it was just this really crazy scramble to try to create a lab and have it up and running in time for harvest. And it was an early harvest that year. It was like, I think people were picking fruit now, early August. And hired a great team of techs that were super great at kind of rolling with this craziness that was happening. I remember, first day of work, they're showing up, and the counters are being installed, and but also the tech is there to install our wine scan, and so they had to put in a counter to put the wine scan on. It was, but they were great and rolled with it. It was honestly not a fun situation, that first harvest. Very stressful. But man, the industry was so generous, and people came out and happy to see the lab in, super supportive, and kind of rolled with our startup wonkiness. We didn't end up invoicing people for a couple months because we didn't get the invoicing side of it set up, and it was just crazy. But little by little, and all the techs that have been there, all the employees that have been there, everybody has contributed to that lab. And we just have, over the years, we just kept getting better and better. We just kept improving things, and things would come up and we would fix it. Things would come up, we'd fix it. And so now where we've arrived is COVID times, And we go to this system where, one person works in the morning, one person works in the afternoon. I come in the middle part of the day, I come in at the end of the day to overlap a little bit. But for the most part, it's just one person running the show, and they're great. Systems are all in place. Okay, something's always going to come up with analyzers, you roll with it. We have redundancy and all that. So, and it also, with COVID, it has allowed me to kind of extract myself from the lab. And say, they've got it. I don't need to be there running pHs. I should be working on bigger things, like what are the next things that we're going to do as a lab? So that's been a real silver lining with COVID, has been forcing me to just stay home and stay out of there and let these really talented people do their thing.
Once you got up and running, and once you especially got through the first harvest, did you find, obviously you'd been out of the lab for a little while at that point, did you find that much had changed in terms of winemaker demand or knowledge or sort of buy-in to what you were doing?
So the biggest thing when we decided to launch our own lab is that we knew we wanted to do a different model. So we wanted to offer the same tests, but we wanted to package them differently. And so what we embraced was an approach that emphasized running full panels on every sample. To incentivize this, we created a pricing structure that to run a full panel only costs a few bucks more than to run a single test. So if you want to run a malic acid, I think it's like 22 bucks, something like that. Or you can run a full malic panel, it's like 27 bucks. And this stems from some frustration with being in the previous lab where people would come in, they'd bring in samples, and because they were trying to save money, they would just run malic acid. The analyzers show us all the numbers. So we run the sample, we see all the numbers, but we're only going to give you malic acid. But we can see, okay, the VA is climbing on that sample, but they haven't bought it, so we're not showing it. The SO2s. That to me was really important, was to give people a full picture of every sample so that they could really see how the numbers stitch together over time. The other thing is that from working in wineries and helping those wineries, sometimes helping them collect samples. Collecting a sample takes time, It's a time-consuming task, especially if you're talking about barrels or... People put a lot of time and effort into getting the sample to the lab. And so, for me, the thought of running just one, giving them just one number, doesn't make sense. So that was actually the thing that we had to kind of tune people into, was that, hey, we've got a different structure to our pricing. For a few bucks more, you can just run the full panel and we'll show you all your numbers. Doesn't affect the turnaround time, Our turnaround time is about half a day, usually faster than that. And so once people latched onto that, people were very receptive to that. Yeah.
Well, we've talked a little bit about 2020 already. We'll talk a bit more about it from a couple different perspectives. I'm very curious about the second part of the year, but I'm going to talk about the first part of the year first. You mentioned COVID. Tell me about, as COVID hits last spring, sort of immediate personal and or professional reaction to it, and what were the changes you had to make in the kind of immediate aftermath to make the business work and to get through the year?
Yeah, so I think this is where also doing barrels was interesting, because that barrel decision happens in the early spring. And so it was interesting to be having conversations with people, and they were like, they're trying to gauge how this unknown thing is going to impact their business, and do they really want to commit to buying barrels when they don't know how the pandemic is going to play out? And so definitely saw a scale back in barrel orders. So that was the first part of it for sure. As far as the lab went, it didn't really affect it, because the samples that were coming through were the previous vintage, right? That's kind of what people were working. They already had the wine, and so they kind of needed to keep it going, right? You couldn't really pull the plug on it and just say, we're gonna just abandon this wine. So the samples stayed steady through the fall. And because generally speaking, people were able to kind of pivot to some interesting ways to sell wine, and a lot of people had decent sales during COVID and felt pretty positive. So going into last harvest, honestly, we were feeling pretty good. Even though it was COVID time, we really were expecting it to be a very, very busy harvest, which it turned out not to be.
So tell me about harvest and your perceptions of it from your side, and also your role in it, obviously in a kind of an unforeseen situation.
Yeah, so it was that was hard to watch, actually. Watch our clients have to, with the smoke and the uncertainty, to have to make some really big business decisions really quickly with very little information. I really felt for everybody that was going through that, and everybody was going through it, I think that's what was so unique about it, is that it just affected everybody. And everybody was in the same boat, and nobody had any information. And so that was really tough. And then of course I felt badly that as a lab, we weren't able to offer that information. We weren't able to give people numbers. Smoke analysis is well outside of the model of what we're trying to do. This thing of like quality assurance. And ETS buying VinQuery wasn't available. ETS was backlogged. Some other companies launched smoke analysis. I heard of people sending samples to Australia. There's real kind of desperation for numbers, but you just couldn't get the numbers in time to make decisions using those numbers. So it's something that I'm looking forward to, kind of, as the dust settles, hearing how it worked out for people. COVID-wise, we haven't been doing barrel tastings. I've chosen not to go into cellars to do barrel tastings. So that's typically where you kind of talk about the vintage and that sort of thing. So hopefully next spring we'll kind of cycle back to it and hear how 2020 kind of played out for people. People now are still trying to, work on making sure the wines are clean and sellable. And I've been making a point of, anytime I see a 2020 wine on the supermarket shelf, pick it up and give it a try. And so far, everything's tasted great. So I'm personally cautiously optimistic about it. since we all know what happened, I think we have a natural bias to maybe look for this impact, but I'm not sure that the average consumer is that it's gonna be a huge deal. Having said that, I haven't had a chance to taste through the range of impact. So I know that some wine was very clearly like not fixable, and that's too bad. That's too bad. But really, watching people go through that process, us being geared up as a lab to have a big, busy harvest, didn't happen, and then not being able to say yes to people when they wanted to bring us samples for smoke analysis. That was kind of a bummer, but I do want to be careful as the lab grows that we kind of stay within our model. We'll see.
So there's no intention in your mind of adding smoke analysis to what you're already doing then?
Not at least not in the near term. Getting into those types of analyses becomes a different animal. The lab becomes a different animal. And it's something that's in the back of my mind, but really right now I'm more interested in taking our model, which has been really successful and has helped a lot of people, I think, and how do we get those services out into the world so that when these events happen, again, going back to this, making a clean, sound wine. Okay, then when things come up like smoke or different types of vintages or whatever comes up, and things are always going to come up, at least what you're working on is something that has a good foundation. You're already working on a sound wine. And then you can work on the other things, to make sure that what ends up in the bottle is something you're proud of.
So we talked about your initial impressions of Oregon wine earlier. I'm curious, in your time working with the industry, what have you noticed that's changed? What are the biggest changes you've seen, and kind of what does the industry look like now in 2021, especially as compared to your initial impression?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of what you'd expect with an industry that's growing and getting older. The people who were dropping off samples when we first came up, they were the owner winemakers. That was who I was interfacing with. And that certainly is still happening with new wineries that are coming in. But, those wineries have become really successful and have grown, and some of them have sold, and the teams have gotten bigger, and which is super great to see, your friends kind of achieve that level of success after knowing how hard winemaking is, as a process, as a business. So that's obviously super satisfying for me to see and feel like I had a part in helping them achieve that. Still see younger people coming through. I love that. Interesting to see what the Linfield program kind of becomes, and how younger people are prepped to contribute to the industry. For me, it's just really satisfying to see everything kind of so dialed in, and to see talk about individual wineries and their success, but really all along, everybody's been working on brand Oregon, right? And the lab was always I think was a really big part of that, of helping brand Oregon elevate. Mm-hmm. You kind of have to have everybody have their quality up mm-hmm. to bring the whole brand up, mm-hmm. the bigger brand. If some people are doing fantastic quality, but other people are not doing good enough quality, then that's always going to hold the bigger brand back. And I feel like Oregon has done a fantastic job of getting to that threshold where it's really, really unlikely that you're going to get a bottle of Oregon wine that isn't at least a clean, mm-hmm. sound mm-hmm. wine. Mm-hmm. Stylistically differences, but the prospect of getting a bad bottle of Oregon wine, I think I really never expect that to happen if I'm at a restaurant or whatever. Mm-hmm. We just bought a place down in Texas, and this little town, they've got a small wine shop. Went in there and talking to the person in there, and I work in the wine industry in Oregon. She's like, oh man, everybody comes in here, all they want is a Willamette Valley Pinot. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's stuff like that's huge. Mm-hmm. There's been so much work done to build that bigger brand. It's really phenomenal.
Pause real quick.
Yeah.
So the other question I'm curious about, and the sort of the changes in the industry, obviously a lot of new buildings, a lot of new wineries, a lot of new spaces.
Yeah.
When we see them, we see a lot of lab spaces. We see a lot of people working in labs and a lot of enologists on staff and things like that. Is that something that you've noticed as well? And is that something that you have, is there a contribution from your side there as well in consulting or in helping people get those things set up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, I've had to turn some people down as far as consulting goes because I just don't have time to do it anymore. I feel kind of bad about that. But I think there seems to be generally more kind of formal training in the local industry now. People in the industry who have had more formal winemaking training. Mm-hmm. When we first came up here, it was very much kind of people teaching each other. That's fine. But wineries have always needed to have their own in-house capabilities. You just can't submit every sample to the lab, right? You need to be able to run pH in-house, check your free SO2 in-house, have a good way to monitor fermentations. So a handful of analyses I think are really important to have. And then you can add on to that based on your size, how interested you are, if you have space for a lab, this sort of thing. So the independent analytical labs also serve the purpose of being that check to make sure that your own in-house lab is getting accurate numbers. So just because people have their own in-house lab doesn't mean they completely abandon running samples through us. That's always going to be an important part of what we do. And in fact, I encourage people that whenever they submit samples to us, it's a great time to also run it yourself to see if your in-house stuff is matching up. We started going with, this past year we did a kind of a trial project with a bigger winery where they reached out to me about, we're thinking about getting a spectrophotometer, doing in-house enzymatic analysis, and do you have any recommendations on what we should get? And I was like, well, I could give you some ideas, but, I've always had this idea of offering kind of a fixed rate, flat monthly fee package for wineries. bigger wineries. And we just finished up a year of doing that, and it was great. You know, it made it really easy for them. They could just bring us samples, and some of the stuff they were checking in-house too, but the bigger things, bringing us samples. And so I'm interested to maybe explore that more with other people. Because even if you're a medium-sized winery, it can still be challenging to, as people cycle through, different techs cycle through, and it can still be challenging to make sure that those, the lab is generating accurate numbers. Something new that we're kind of working on.
Always something.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to be that's the way it works.
So what about as you look ahead for the Oregon wine industry? What as we eventually, hopefully, come out of a pandemic here, what does the industry look like in the upcoming years? Is there anything you're sort of looking ahead to or forward to? And conversely, anything that you're fearful of as you look ahead for the industry?
I think I honestly don't do much like looking too far in the future. My experience has been that, yeah, there's been a lot of growth and a lot of new people coming in, but winemaking seems to really just attract interesting and talented people. And so, sure, the industry has grown and changed, and but the people that are coming in still seem like they're nice additions to the industry. You know, investments in new facilities and investments in vineyards. I think it's nice to see. Be interesting to see how McMinnville and the area are affected by that. My wife owns the bookstore here in town, and you know, so we participate on 3rd Street, and the business is on 3rd Street, and you know, people need places to live. So for me, it's kind of about the wine industry, but I think about it more in terms of like the bigger community and how we navigate livability. I think that's going to be super interesting to watch.
So before we talk about your own future, I'm curious, you brought up the other thing you're doing. I mentioned, as if you have all this spare time for extra things, you mentioned your mediation work. I'm curious how that came about and what the sort of work you're doing with that.
I was first introduced to mediation when a buddy of mine had to go to small claims court. This is Portland many years ago. And he's like, do you mind coming with me just to go through this process? I was like, okay, sure. And went, and it was my friend and the other party, and then the court mediator. So the idea being that it goes to mediation first. If it can't be resolved in mediation, then it goes to the judge. And so I was just an observer, just watching, and it was just this fantastic process of this mediator, like, kind of navigating this dialogue and facilitating a dialogue and letting people's emotions go a little bit and bringing them back in, and then, you know, meeting in the middle. And neither side got exactly what they, exactly everything that they wanted, compromise, but everybody left and they were done with it and moved on with their lives. And that made a big impression on me. So when we're getting to where our daughters were high school, college, okay, empty nest is on the horizon. What are you going to do? Because we've always been really family focused, and kind of remembered mediation, and so did some Googling, and McMinnville has a mediation organization. Reached out and oh yeah, we have a basic training session coming up. And the first time I reached out, the session was in October, right during harvest. I couldn't do it. But a year later, I think it was still actually during harvest, but I like made it happen. And went through the training, and I've just have been trying to practice ever since. You know, I mean, mediations are just practice for the next mediation. End up doing a lot of small claims court mediations, which have been on hold because of COVID, which has been kind of a drag. So haven't really been doing hardly any of it for however long, 18 months. But hoping that we can get over this hump and kind of get back to doing more of it. I love it.
You find you enjoy it?
Yeah, it's really satisfying. I mean, it doesn't always work. You know, sometimes, you know, small claims, people's differences are too far apart, and but sometimes, you know, help people do like a lot of hard work, and we've done some, you know, family mediations that are like that, where, you know, you have to unpack a fair amount of stuff to kind of get to like what the conflict is, and you know, that process can be really rewarding. Keeping it all kind of mediation based, not like, I'm not a professional psychologist or psychiatrist or therapist or anything like that, but just helping people have conversations and fix things kind of on their own. It's satisfying.
And you have all the winery mediation background already, so you're way ahead of the game.
I'm curious. I would be interested to do mediations in the wine industry, actually. You know, I know certain things come up in all businesses, but you know, there's some interesting relationships in the wine industry. The grower winery relationship, that's something that's always kind of being navigated. I feel like YCM could be useful for people having those conversations, especially in the smoke year. But fortunately, you know, a lot of feedback I got from wineries was that people just recognize that, you know what, this is a long-term partner, the vineyard. We're gonna do the right thing, whatever those people decided was the right thing, you know. And I heard a lot of that, like wineries stepping up and being, we're gonna share in that loss. I thought that was really cool. I'm not sure that would happen in other places.
So what's look ahead for you then? You mentioned you bought a place in Texas. That's a bit of a life change there. Tell me about what's coming next for you. What are you looking forward to in the future?
You know, for me, yeah, I'm really looking forward to watching the two analysts that I have in the lab now continue to improve and finding ways to kind of keep their talents going. And like I say, trying to find ways to get our model into the hands of more people. So what we're exploring now is the possibility of taking the model to other places. Obviously be a big project and become something much different to have remote labs. But it's been so satisfying watching this industry embrace the model and watching it really help people. Also not a big fan of like having people send us samples. A lot of people send us samples from a lot of different places. But, you know, from a, I don't know, carbon footprint, do the right thing kind of standpoint, yeah, I don't know, shipping samples isn't the greatest. So maybe we can maybe we can do little satellite labs around and just sort of stick to our model and not try to be huge and sophisticated, just be small and sophisticated. So we'll see. Nothing certain, but we're working on some stuff, and certain things have to fall into place just right. But I'm also looking forward to having less on my plate, so I can do more mediation and stuff like that.
All right. That's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here that we should have covered?
I feel like we covered just about everything. Yeah. I think my story is probably similar to a lot of people's stories, and how they wind up in the industry is can be sort of serendipitous. And no, I appreciate you guys doing this whole thing. Like I said, scrolling through the list of people that you've interviewed and seeing names of people that are no longer with us is, that's a great service to have that captured. And so I love what you're doing. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Yeah,
Appreciate you taking the time and coming and joining us today. We will go ahead and let you off the hook.
All right, sounds great.